So 1 out of 5 women in the U.S. were in the paid workforce in 1890. Marriage generally meant that women left the paid workforce forever, and probably were glad to, if we go to books written and testimonies provided to middle-class reformers. Daily shopping, laundry, house cleaning, and childcare took hours. And women, to make extra money, would take in sewing and laundry. And many families took in boarders that they cooked for and cleaned up after, the women doing the cooking and the cleaning up. In order, if they had a spare half a room, you would take in a boarder who would live with you and contribute a portion of their paycheck to support the family that was housing them. The next level up would live in boarding houses like Harold Lloyd and his roommate did in Safety Last. In the poorest communities, the very poorest communities, women continued working even after they married and had children. So the ability of a working class woman to focus on house and family work, even if the family was poor, became an important indicator in the community and in society at large of a family's status, their security, and their overall health. Groups with high levels of women working were stigmatized as low class, ignorant, dangerous, and uncivilized. Now, women's work was typically discussed by middle-class reformers at the time as one of the sources of a community's poverty. That is, if only the women could stay at home, then somehow or other they could take care of the house, and there'd be a cleanliness and health everywhere, and the family would live better and be healthier, and they'd make more money. So they viewed it as the cause of a problem rather than the result. And to solve the problem, they formed girls' clubs in the 1890s to provide educational opportunities for young working-class girls that might allow them to escape the cycle of poverty. And then boys' clubs followed with the idea that young men needed extra encouragement to better themselves. Despite these opportunities, provided by concerned philanthropists, working class men and women faced a host of assumptions about who they were, why they were poor, assumptions that underscored essentially the justice of their being locked into low-paying, dead-end, irregular work, or the belief that as a whole, these were depraved, ignorant people who could not benefit from ameliorative programs, which were thus a waste of time and money and the cause of frustration for all concerned. So middle-class Americans were going back and forth between, is it even worth doing anything for the very poor, versus what might be effective. And in principle, actually nothing, very little was effective because the circumstances in which people lived and the circumstances of how they related to the larger community all came together to keep them locked into a particular position. To escape all of this meant upgrading your skill level and developing a trade identity so that you were no longer just a poor Irish person. You were a carpenter who was Irish or Slovenian. But access to jobs were carefully controlled by family and ethnic networks. And these networks were supported by allies in the developing ethnic-dominated urban political machines, which raided each other in efforts to broaden employment opportunities. So ethnic ties linking people of common national or even regional background, that is Sicilian versus Calabrese versus Tuscan versus Venetian, could be very important in terms of how you were positioned in the labor market and whether you got a job that would keep you in the unskilled workers or allow you to rise up into the semi-skilled workers. These ties, these ethnic ties, were much more important than the class ties that the trade unions movement emphasized. And the saloon, the church, the fraternal order, the death benefit and burial societies, and the gang were all the most important social organizations for workers, and they were all ethnically based rather than class-based, or racially based, if you want to use the terms of the time. So everything in your life, for most workers, reinforced immediate blood ties and ethnic loyalties. And political machines work through those institutions. Middle-class reformers like to think of themselves as operating at a level above ethnicity, that indeed U.S. nationality and culture was universal, but whenever they tried to address a problem of the poor, they entered a world determined by racial and ethnic connections, and thus middle-class reform generally appeared as a project for social control by the most powerful racial ethnic group in the country, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, who increasingly began to describe themselves as a distinct and superior social group. This is what I'm trying to discuss is how a 20th century practice of racism, of race and racism, had some foundations in the structure of the labor market itself and its relationship to the housing market and other ways in which people had to live. It's not the only explanation, because clearly racist ideology, racist ideas had existed for a long time. But it's not, in this case, we're not even talking about ideas, we're talking about basic practices, things people had to do in order to do their everyday lives, regardless of what they may or may not have thought or felt. You were always reminded of your ethnic loyalties. And they were loyalties. And if you lost track of those, if you let go of those loyalties, you were as good as dead. And again, I mean that literally. So, let's see, what time is it? I think we've come, when we resume on Wednesday, we'll get back to the semi-skilled and the skilled workers and their lives.